All right. Welcome to the Generation Lyme podcast. My name is Jesse Ruben. I am joined this evening by two other members of the Generation Lyme board, Jennifer Hoffmann and Brooke Stoddard. How are you guys doing today?
Good. How are you?
Doing great. Jennifer,
I'm great.
how
And a
you
bit of a
feeling,
flare.
Jennifer? Yeah.
Yeah. Don't want to lie to our people.
Yeah. Totally get it. We are here to talk about our recent day of advocacy. Before we get into it, if you like this content and you want to support us, please rate us 5 stars on the App Store. I am very competitive, and we have way fewer reviews than some other Lyme disease podcasts, and I would like that to change. So please give us a 5-star review and write something nice about us. That would be awesome. Um, we are here to talk about. We had a day last week where we spent the day with a couple hundred people around the country to do advocacy work for Lyme disease. And we thought it would be important to talk about what that day was like before, during, and after. And yeah, we're going to go over it for the community. So just to start us off here, Brooke, we'll have you go first. Why is advocacy for Lyme disease important?
Well, I would say there are many ways to support Lyme disease patients and Lyme disease prevention and research. And advocacy is one of those ways. So advocacy can mean lots of different things for different people. It can mean telling one story of having Lyme disease and sort of battling it and experimenting with different treatments to get better. But advocacy can also mean talking to congressmen and essentially asking the federal government to spend more money on Lyme disease research and prevention and education and diagnostic tools. And so that is what the three of us helped to do last week at the Center for Lyme Action fly-in to Washington, D.C.
First of all, womp womp fly in, because none of us went anywhere, but totally. Jennifer, why do you feel like advocacy is so important for this cause?
I feel like it's so important for this cause because I feel like it's so important for any cause and like anything people feel is a cause. Um, I've personally been passionate about this kind of thing for a long time, though I haven't really participated in Lyme advocacy before, or not in this way. Um, yes, I completely agree with everything Brooke said about it being advocacy being something you can do in a variety of ways and probably should do because just one kind might not get the job done. And in this case, as in every case, I feel like the numbers tell a story. And so the more people we can get involved in as many ways as they can or want to be involved in, the better off we will all be. And so I wanted to take my personal interest in advocacy and my participation with Generation Lyme and Project Lyme and just how much I care about the situation we're dealing with on top of kind of needing the advocacy to work. for, yeah, it wasn't even a question in my mind.
Yeah, to me, I think it's similar. Leading the meetups, one of the things that I say a lot, especially to new participants, is that unfortunately in the Lyme community, we are tasked with saving ourselves, which is why we have our meetups in the first place, so that you can ask questions to other Lyme patients that have been through the same experiences and have a lot of medical knowledge and just experience with it. And I think in a similar way, like this is sort of the same thing. The reason we have to do this in the first place is because the government and the medical community at large is just really not cutting it for us. And so again, we are tasked with having to save ourselves, which in this case looks like banging down the doors, metaphorically speaking, of government officials to essentially beg them to throw money our way. So to me, it all just sort of like, it really lines up also with our message at Generation Lyme too. I feel like we've done a pretty good job over the last year or so of creating these meetups and being able to help a pretty small number of people quite a lot. You know, like our community is really strong, but compared to the all of the people who have Lyme in the country and globally, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. And this was a way for me to feel like I was at least having some impact on the Lyme disease community at large, as opposed to just like the hundreds or dozens or thousands of people that have come to our meetups, if that makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. We help ourselves by helping other people who help us by
Yes,
helping other people.
that's right.
Yeah.
Was there anything about this specifically that made you want to participate?
Yeah. Well, this is interesting for me. I am interested in politics, but what we did at the fly-in, I want to make clear, is like actually different than politics. Like political news and theater are one thing that people think about when they hear the term politics. This is a very different process that we were involved in. And to sort of put this in really sort of simple terms, every year the government has a budget and figures out how much money Congress is allowed to give to different initiatives that would help people across the country. And so what we participated in, the three of us, in addition to about 250 other Lyme advocates, was to ask, probably well over 100 Congress people to basically go to their subcommittees in the government and then ask the subcommittees to essentially get different parts of the government, like the CDC or the National Institute of Health, or some branches of the military, to give about $158 million to Lyme disease research, prevention, and better diagnostic tools. So if anyone is listening to this and is thinking of the word politics, this is actually like a different and very important process that the government goes through every year that might feel a little different than political party does this, political party does that. This is just like another way to get involved in the federal government's process that is very, very important and can be truly influential in the lives of Lyme disease patients.
I think that's a great point, because even while we were leading up to it and on the calls, and they were talking about how this is all bipartisan work and you're going to have to be speaking to people who you don't agree with. And even then, even with something that is obviously like the number one cause, like thing that I am super passionate about as far as causes go, in my head, I was like, please don't make me talk to somebody who I completely disagree with. Like, even with this, which is so important, in my head, I was being partisan about it. And it was actually like, I kept having to remind myself, like, oh, right, this is a bipartisan issue. It's okay that it's a bipartisan issue. It's just, to me, like, that is like a dirty word to me sometimes. And I think this process shows that I guess that's actually possible sometimes, maybe, question mark. I don't know. Jennifer, what was it like for you to participate in this? What about this made you want to be a part of it?
Let's see. I think that what you just said was a really valuable admission, so I appreciated the honesty a lot.
I mean,
I think that may be very useful for people to hear that you kind of like did it anyway.
I don't think it's any question to people who have heard me speak for more than 40 seconds that I'm like incredibly liberal, and the fact that like
what?
the fact that we have like that one of the leaders in Congress is Collins, who I have very strong opinions about, but on this particular issue we overlap, is like, that's hard for me to admit sometimes, like that she's right about something, because we're so trained to completely despise the other side. And mostly of the time I think there's good cause for that, but in this particular instance, I think it's hard to put those biases aside in order to move forward, which is probably part of the problem, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting and accurate here. So, what was your question again?
Oh yeah,
was it
just about why you wanted to participate in it.
This migraine is going well.
You're doing great.
I wanted to participate in it for the reasons that I kind of outlined earlier. It didn't even feel like it didn't feel optional. It's just in the sense that it felt just natural, like I must, because we finally have an opportunity to make our case in a little more detail with FaceTime with certain people, and to connect in this way which we don't normally get to do because, as we've kind of already stated, Lyme patients are tired on top of having other people are sick. It's hard to get to do anything, let alone get together and do a big project like that. So that was pretty exciting. And I really wanted to understand the process. I wanted to get involved, just at all. And I've been really interested in civic engagement for a long time. And like I said, types of advocacy. And I don't think that any one thing is the only way to do anything. So it's great that some people kind of go out in the street, and it's great that some people write letters, and it's great that people have meetings. And I really think they're all important because they're all a really important form of engagement to making any case. And when it comes to this subject, not that long ago, but it feels like a lifetime ago, when I was a little more active, I ended up talking to a lot of people about how they felt about the political scene or their lives here, right? And there was a very common theme among every single person I talked to. Not even exaggerating. Every single person said, "I really care a lot, but I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I don't know how to get involved." And so for us here, we all really care a lot. We come to this issue every day, and we work on it as much as we can. And here we had an opportunity where someone gave us something to do. This is a lane for you. You have a date set. And so, yeah, I wanted to be involved. And it was definitely, I felt good about it. It was tiring. It was at some points frustrating, but I was also I was just very happy to be there. And it was certainly eye-opening.
Yeah. I do also just want to give a shout out to Project Lyme, because the reason that we were even able to be involved was that they had partnered with Center for Lyme Action to help make the day possible, which is how Generation Lyme got involved. But I also think, just from the three of us, separate from, because I know there were about 250 people that were involved, but for the three of us specifically, I really feel like as one of the leaders, of the like young people part of this movement, I really feel like we have a sense of responsibility for the people in our community to represent them. Me especially, like being fully in remission, sometimes I feel like I'm not ever doing enough, especially compared to some of you guys who are dealing with health issues on a regular basis. Like, I just remember laying in bed sick 6 years ago thinking, if and when I ever get better, I was dreaming about like arguing in front of Congress back in 2013. You know what I mean? So the fact that I was able to even do anything remotely approaching that was very, very exciting to me. And I think because we're on the board of this organization, it's important to us to put our money where our mouth is and be participating in these types of things going forward, for sure. Personally.
Amen.
So
I agree.
So for people who are listening to this who think that sounds amazing, but I'm not qualified and I have no idea what that would even look like, Brooke, let's talk about just like what the lead up was like before we even had the day, just very quickly. And then also, Brooke, can you go over what appropriations are and all of that stuff very quickly?
Sure, I'll do my best. So for anyone listening, you should totally get involved next year. It's a lot of fun. Essentially, the process is run by an organization called Center For Lyme Action, which was founded by Bonnie Crater, who also founded Bay Area Lyme Foundation in California. And she partnered with her brother, Jeff, who has a career in Washington, D.C. and understands government budget processes really well. So what Bonnie and her brother did was create a 501c4, which is slightly different from a nonprofit, which would be a 501c3. And a 501c4 can talk to government officials and essentially ask the federal government for funding for something specific. In this case, to fund Lyme disease research and education and better blood tests and prevention strategies. And what Bonnie and her brother Jeff did extraordinarily well was, one, kind of get this like massive group of Lyme disease advocates, just like the three of us all together. As Jesse mentioned, there are 250 of them. and Bonnie and her brother basically set up meetings that these 250 people could have all day long on one particular day over Zoom with dozens and dozens of congressmen and senators in Washington, D.C. So to put some like real numbers on this, I was basically in 5 different meetings. 2 were with senators, Schumer and Gillibrand, and 3 were with congressional representatives who have districts in New York, because I live in New York City. And so I was in sort of the New York meetings. And before the meetings, I attended, I think, at least 2 trainings to understand from Center for Lyme Action what.
Wait, were there more than 2? I thought there were only 2. I only went to 2. I think there were at least 2. I think,
Wait a second.
Brooke, were there other secret trainings?
No, I think there were 2, but there was a lot of training.
I just want people to get an idea. Like, it wasn't like we went through this like intensive weeks long thing, right? It was like 2 hour long Zoom calls, not even. And the first one was basically like an introduction and going over the materials. And then the second one was a little bit more, and I guess a little bit of about like what the actual meetings would look like. And then a little bit, and then the second one was was supposed to be about getting into groups, but then we kind of ran out of time, because when you have 250 people on a Zoom call, things can kind of get out of whack. Jennifer, what was your impression of those like training calls? What was that? How did you feel about those?
Oh, well, I thought primarily kind of just, wow, they're really corralling a lot of people in this Zoom meeting. And there was a lot going on between the people speaking with their cameras on and the microphones on, and then the people that were asking questions in the chat and trying to figure out whether or not they had received the materials and all of that. And so I felt like it was interesting. It felt a little chaotic at times, but I was also, I mean, I don't want to, it's not a knock on the organizers, because they have been doing this. And so to come in and assume that I could never assume that I would do it any better.
Well, it's also, it's
terrible.
Like COVID, it's virtual instead of in person.
Yeah. There was such a,
they were supposed to mail all of us like this really intense scarf that's the Center for Lyme Action, which looked like a, like Slytherin Harry Potter scarf
with a tick,
with like giant ticks on it. And then also like all the materials, but of course, with the mail, like I got 2 packages, one before and one like a week after. Some people didn't get any. Like,
gotten any.
I know. See, some people didn't. And I think we have to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here, because I don't know about you, but like when I saw 250 people on that first call, I just was like, I was blown away. I thought there were going to be like 14 people. I was legitimately choked up seeing. Now, when you have 250 people on the same Zoom call, you're hoping 250 people will act with good Zoom etiquette, and that is hard to do. So there were, of course, going to be issues, but just the fact that there were that many people, to me, I think was really special.
That's very much how I felt too. I mean, when I say chaotic, it's because we're all working on our Zoom etiquette, and that's not the thing that's been practiced by this group before. And so it's just a little, we're catching up so we can kind of get to the point.
Full disclosure, we were all making fun of the older people who couldn't get their Zooms to work during those.
You're giving away the secrets. Hey,
but it's like everyone is trying their best, and I am always going to be snarky about that, because I am a snarky guy. I will also say that they used a company called Advocacy Express, and we used their
Advocacy Associates.
Thank you, Advocacy Associates. Thank you. And it was on their platform that all these meetings were set up, and that actually worked wonderfully, as far as like we could see the representative whose office we were talking to, who we were going to be speaking to. It had a link to the calls, whether that was a phone call or a video call. It had a place to take notes. It had a place to chat with the other people that were going to be in the meetings. One thing that I will say that got a little hectic leading up to it, and we were at a slight disadvantage because we were in New York, and I think there were a lot of people in New York as opposed to other markets that had smaller groups, we had sometimes 8, 10, 12, 25 people on the Schumer meeting, and we had to pick a leader for each of those meetings. And that got a little confusing leading up to it, of like, there was all of a sudden all these emails. Who wants to do this? Who's going to do it? I don't want to do it. I'm new. I don't know. I've done it before. Maybe I'll like, I think that was a little chaotic, but then once that got nailed down, especially throughout the course of the day, it got a little bit easier and a little bit better. But I think, and we're going to get into what we would change later, but I think one of the things is like being really clear about getting people into groups and choosing who's going to lead those meetings, because you only have, we had like 15, 20 minutes tops with a representative from each office. And so it's really easy to like waste that time. And so I think having the leader selected ahead of time would have been helpful.
Can I just jump in again real quick?
Please.
I'm afraid of sounding like too critical about it. I thought that the platform was great.
Yeah.
I loved how it laid out what our meetings would be, when they would take place, and everything that you said. And I was totally floored by how many people came, and the variation in geography and the age diversity. I really liked those aspects too.
Yeah.
And the amount of support that existed within the group itself, how everybody was really cheering each other on, and then how the community behaved about it as well. People who didn't come there were so many really nice messages throughout the day that I saw on a variety of platforms. And I really felt like this was a wonderful thing that got set up, an amazing opportunity for our community at large.
Totally. Let's talk about the day of. What was your experience like? And before either of you start, I just want to say that my first meeting was at 9 a.m., which is just, I'm a musician anyway. So between that and Lyme things, like I do not do mornings. So I just want it noted for the record that I was there on time, ready to go for a 9 a.m. meeting. That's how important this was. All these people that get up at like 6 who are listening to this are going to be like, we hate you. I don't care. I was there and I was proud. Brooke, because Jennifer and I were in the same, there were like basically two New York groups. So Jennifer and I were basically in all the same meetings all day. And then you were sort of off on your own without us. Talk to me about your experience of the day, what it was like for you, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit about like what actually happens in
Yeah,
these meetings.
exactly.
Like what do we actually do in them?
Mm-hmm.
So my day felt pretty jam-packed. I had 5 different meetings with 2 senators from New York, and then 3 congressmen and congresswomen from Long Island, and also one of them represented Brooklyn in New York City. And in each of these 5 meetings, I was in a group of, at one point, 2 people, and at one point over 20 people.
That's amazing that you had 3, because Jennifer and I, the smallest we had was like 9. So that's
yeah. I did a double take.
Yeah. Oh, also before we go there, we didn't even talk about what we're supposed to cover in the meetings, which is what we went over in these training calls. So I just want to touch on that briefly. There were basically 6 points that we were supposed to, 6 specific asks that we had to make to these politicians or their representatives. We're not going to get into all of them, but basically funding the K-Hagen Tick Act was the biggest one. That was supposed to be given $150 million in funding over the next 5 years, which means $30 million annually. And the way that breaks down is 10 was going towards research grants and 20 was going towards prevention and response. Unfortunately, instead of getting 30 million annually, we only got 4 million in seed money for 2021. So we were basically asking the government to give us the money that they asked for. Some of the other things were for peer-reviewed research and actually tracking how many cases there are. Most new cases are tracked, but not chronic. And without those numbers, without getting a realistic look at the numbers, it's hard to figure out how much money we actually need. And then basically the other big ask, which we can also get into later, was that for Lyme disease gets $63 per patient in funding, compared to other vector-borne illnesses like West Nile virus, which gets $13,000 per $13,000 of funding per patient, and malaria, which gets $118,000 of funding per patient. So that's how underfunded Lyme disease is. And we were basically tasked with introducing ourselves, giving a quick version of why we were there and why we cared, and then immediately diving into those 6 asks and then asking for appropriations forms, which was a whole other thing. Sorry, we skipped over all of that, and I wanted to make sure we got it in. So, Brooke, you had 5 meetings on the day, ranging from 3 to 25 people.
Yeah, and actually what I wanted to cover is exactly what you just said. All of the meetings are essentially the same. You know, like in every meeting, we would introduce ourselves if the group was small enough to let us do that. So I'm Brooke Stoddard. I live in New York City. I've had Lyme disease for 10 years. This is a very important issue for me. You know, you're my congressman. You would say that if you were actually a constituent. So that was part one. Part two was congressman or, you know, congresswoman, we are here today because we want to ask you for appropriations for 6 different initiatives to fund Lyme disease research and prevention and diagnostic tools. The first one is we're asking for $30 million to fund the Kay Hagan Tick Act in fiscal year 22. And then you might talk through like one reason why that's important. And then you move on to the next, and then the third, fourth, fifth, until the 6th.
Did you lead one?
I led one meeting.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. So how was that? Because Jennifer and I didn't lead all day. We were mostly just listening and having opinions. But
those times we did jump in.
Except when we did jump in,
which we should talk about, but yeah.
Totally. We're going to get to all of that. But what was it like? Were you like excited? Were you nervous? Did you feel like you did a good job? Was it better to lead versus just to listen? Which did you prefer? What was that like?
I was nervous and I felt like I did a good job. So both. I certainly prepared. I talked myself through the talking points a couple of times so that it felt like muscle memory when I had to do it. But you know, I tried to remind myself I'm talking to a real person. And in the meeting that I led, I was talking to a staff member who works really hard for a particular congressman. And I just had to get out what the 6 asks were. And then the staff member, a legislative assistant, was gonna take notes and like pass on the notes to the congressman. And then after the meeting, hopefully the congressman would go and then, you know, fight for Lyme disease patients by asking the government for
hopefully
money in the 6 ways that we asked them to. And before I stop talking, the last part of the process, which is really, really important, is when you ask representatives to basically petition the federal government for money, it's very important to have a record of that. So one, if anyone listening is doing this next year, you want to send thank you notes to the congressional offices, and you want to ask the congressional offices for appropriations forms, which in my case were basically Google surveys that I would fill out and say, I'm asking for $30 million to fund the Kay Hagan Tick Act. So that is very important, because then there's a record that a constituent or someone, you know, who cares about this issue has asked the office for funding for a specific purpose.
I thought that was interesting because I was expecting like a very official looking document for those, but it was just a Google Doc thing.
Yeah, it's a Google Doc
that had to be filled out, like a Google form. And that shocked me every time. I just thought that was very funny. Jennifer, I know that you and I spent most of the day on Zoom calls and texting each other. What was it like for you?
I want to make a point that physically it was a long day.
Yeah.
It was very long, and by the end I was toast. So it's kind of just want to reinforce how it is difficult for our Lyme disease patients, and not just exclusively Lyme disease patients, but our community to do this. So it is a bit of a physically demanding.
Yeah, I mean, our first one was at 9 a.m. I think our last one was at 4 o'clock.
Yeah. But so how was the day? It was really interesting because, as you said, we were in the same group, and generally the same 2 people led our smaller meetings. For our meetings with the senators, where we were all in the same group. The, I guess, leaders of the New York segment of our community, who clearly had done it before, took those meetings and led those. But in our smaller meetings, the people who led had never led before, and they wanted to give it a try, and because no one in our meetings had led before. So it was really interesting to just kind of observe how they went about it. And because it seemed like they might start the day by just reading the piece of paper that we'd been given, which was a little dry. And then by the second run, they were adding a little more personal anecdotes. And that was, I don't know, it was very human, very real. And it was very interesting to me to just, I don't know, just kind of get a sense of how the whole thing might work. I was most interested in the sort of human element that people could provide to these meetings, because otherwise they're pretty standard. It doesn't necessarily seem like the person you're meeting with has time for you, even though they're making time. They're always like going between one meeting and another. It might be their lunch break. It might, they're literally in transit at times. And so it was interesting to kind of assess or try to assess like whether or not they were invested in the conversation, but it really seemed like they were, to give all of them credit.
Mm-hmm.
And it did feel like some of the on paper information was so important, but it's really hard to communicate that in a way doesn't sound super dry, and in a way that's going to be memorable, that these 6 detailed asks you're gonna leave that meeting, which is one of 50 you have that day, and remember them. So of course the thank you notes are really important, but it's also, I think you and I, as we were texting about this so much, we shared this question of, can we make these meetings memorable, the meetings themselves? And I felt that once we got into a little more conversation with each of the people that our group was meeting with, I feel like the meeting itself then took on new life. I was particularly interested because just to see how things developed when, if we're speaking to someone working for one of our representatives as a constituent, the moment someone said that, they perked up.
Yeah.
And of course, and I had the pleasure of speaking to the offices of my New York City neighborhood and my parents' neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I think just, even though it's New York and people might assume Lyme disease is everywhere, the assumption that it's in Westchester is pretty common, and that it's in New York City is less accepted. And so it was just interesting to kind of make those points. Some of the information that came out during the conversations themselves were very telling about the gaps we need to fill as a community of advocates to kind of break some misconceptions that are going on, and really connect some dots for people. For example, in one of the meetings we had, the person we were speaking to called Lyme disease a rare disease.
Woof.
And then this is one area in which
I jumped out of my
talking.
seat.
Yeah. I was like, say something, and he did. And then we got to, and it was a really important point, because sometimes I feel that that our community has so much ground to cover that it's very difficult to get the simplest points across, because we spend so much of our time learning as much as we can and getting as detailed as we can to get the science right, to get the numbers right, to really gain our own understanding so that we can help ourselves and potentially help others. But then when it's time to communicate with the outside world, it can get a little muddy. And so it's just, we have to kind of cover really simple ground instead. We have to zoom out of our kind of daily project in this way and communicate to people that Lyme is very common and it's very severe. It's not a rare disease, and it actually can devastate lives, if not end them, and other things in between. It can make you tired. We have to explain these things, and that the reason that the misunderstandings exist, well, one of the reasons is that we don't have good testing. And that's what we're asking for. We're asking for better testing so that we can come to you with the numbers that are real and hopefully from there, determine what treatments may actually help.
Yeah, I think that leads us beautifully to my next question that I wanted to ask you guys, which is, what would you change about the day? And just to Jennifer's point, uh, that to me was also the most telling. It was the last meeting of the day, and I don't remember whose office we were talking to specifically, but he said, like the congressman is very supportive of rare diseases. And that was where I jumped in, because there's obviously a disconnect between, we're coming to you and we're saying there are 500,000 cases of this a year. And on top of that, the test that we currently have is up to 60% wrong. So really, we're actually talking more like 1 million cases, probably more like between 1 and 2, if you're talking about people who aren't even getting tested. But we're being treated and funded as if we are a very rare disease, but we are coming to you with numbers that prove that we are not. And that to me was like the biggest cavern that we need to figure out how to change, because we're coming to these people and saying, this is a big issue and we're being funded like a tiny issue. And you're hearing us, you're listening of us, is that we're it's this tiny thing, and we're just like trying to pound doors down. We're like, no, there's a tidal wave coming. It's already here, and we're just showing you the water. And you're going like, oh, it's just like high tide, it's not a big deal. Like, no, this is a big problem. And I think, to me, that was like the number one thing that we need to, how do we get it across? Because obviously just stating facts is not going to do it. Because either it was in the facts themselves, like the information we gave, or the way that it was presented, or both. But there was definitely a disconnect there. I also think most of the Senate staffers that we were talking to, this is their first job, second job. These people are 20, 21, 22. So when you have someone in their 60s or 70s talking to them, I just don't know if it would be as impactful as having us speak to them. I don't know. That's just a judgment that I had. I think that having young people speak to young people and acknowledge that this is a crazy situation and that they're busy and we understand what their lives are like, I think would have been helpful. The other thing I wish that we had done, which we started to do on our meetings during the end of the day, was ask these people if they know somebody who has Lyme, because that wasn't a part of the training, but so many people have it or know someone or have heard of somebody. Immediately, if they say yes, that immediately establishes a totally different baseline for the conversation, where you're not having to convince them because they already know. Because if everybody knows someone who has Lyme disease, which everybody does, that means it's a giant problem. But because everybody only knows the one person that they know that has Lyme, they think it's just happening to their person and not to everybody else. So I think including like their personal experience right at the top to establish that, I think would have been very effective. What were some other changes that you guys would have made? Were there things that stood out to you? Sorry, I get very passionate about this, so I just talked a lot.
What was that dollar amount that you gave for the
Oh,
amount of money spent per person who has
yeah.
Lyme disease?
So it's $63 per person with
Right.
Lyme and 118,000 for malaria. Just to give you numbers, in fiscal year 2020, the government gave Lyme disease $55 million. In 2021, 91 million. Our goal for this day of advocacy was to get that up to 158 million for fiscal year 2022. And $158 million might sound like a lot, but compared to a disease like Alzheimer's, where there are 6 million people that have Alzheimer's gets $550 million annually from the government. So to me, that was, I guess, thank you for bringing that up. Like, another thing that I would change, I know that you're supposed to, government is a big thing that requires small changes over time. But to me, $158 million is a drop in the bucket. Like, we need to be talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars, because we're talking about millions of patients and millions of people. So I think that's part of the challenge we have, is that government moves slowly, and I am impatient, and I want $1 billion. I want $1 billion, like, at least. Like, how much money are we spending on the military? Can we build one less tank and try and solve this disease? Like, are you serious? I think so. Once we get an accurate diagnostic test and get our numbers realistically, what the numbers in reality that are actually happening, and then people realize how big of a problem this is, then they're all going to be scrambling after the fact to try and throw money at this problem as opposed to doing it now ahead of time. I could talk about this for a very long time.
Yeah. Well, this is a little bit, I know this came up in our last meeting, just really, really explicitly. And I do want to let Brooke speak, but I'm afraid of my migraine that I'm going to completely forget, which I've done throughout this entire conversation. But we have to connect the dots between the numbers of people who have this and the numbers we have a suspicion of that might have this, and compare that with the amount of dollars spent per patient for this very common disease, contrast that with the amount of dollars spent on patients who have more rare or similarly prevalent conditions. And we also have to kind of paint that picture alongside, hey, the testing isn't good, and so we're kind of screwed unless you help us. We're totally screwed. And we have to, on top of that, explain that Lyme disease manifests one way in its early stage as opposed to a completely different way in its later stage. So if it goes untested, if it goes undiagnosed and or untreated, it goes from being something that can cause flu-like symptoms and fatigue to something that will potentially irrevocably harm your heart or your brain or other systems, and that maybe can lead to death, but certainly won't lead to any sort of good quality of life. And that we have a lot of ground to cover, and it was very interesting just to see how that was coming out, because it wasn't part of our script.
I think that is, by the way, why we don't have as much money, is because people think Lyme doesn't kill you, and malaria can kill you, and West Nile virus can kill you. And I think Lyme keeps you alive for a long time. I mean, get mental health and suicide aside, which we can talk about later. And Lyme patients are 12 times more likely to commit suicide than other people. But Lyme doesn't, like, on its face, doesn't kill people, I guess. And I think that's part of one of our big hurdles here, is that people aren't dying.
Or they may be, but we don't have numbers because we don't know who. It might be a secondary event, like a secondary illness, secondary set of symptoms. And those people may or may not be considered CDC positive Lyme cases, so they're not tracked, which was an important thing that we were all asking for.
Yeah.
And it may not kill you, but it may. We've had some Lyme deaths this year. We have them every year. But it can turn you into a vegetable if you're not.
Totally.
And I don't say that lightly, and that's not a funny word. It's just, it's a problem. And so, yeah.
Brooke.
Enough of that, Brooke.
Brooke, what would you change about the experience or the process or anything about it?
I think it's less of a change and more of, I would like people to understand that this is a very accessible volunteer opportunity. There were literally 250 people who volunteered to do this year. And next year, I wouldn't be surprised if there are 500 people. But the process and the government involves some like very fancy vocabulary that can seem really intimidating. Like, what is appropriations anyway?
I still don't know.
Departments have like fancy acronyms, but for anyone listening, you can absolutely do this next year. And you should. It's fun, it's effective. It is a great way to get a ton of money invested in Lyme disease patients and research. And just remember, even though appropriations is a really long word, what this process is you as a constituent of some congressman is basically going to your congresspeople and saying, I essentially am one of your voters and I have Lyme disease. This is a really important underfunded issue. And would you please help the federal government give more money to people like me who have Lyme? And it's that simple. And I will admit, I almost didn't participate this year because I was intimidated and I was lazy, and I would have totally regretted it if I didn't participate. Now I'm going to participate for like every single year going forward. And anyone else who's kind of like on the fence about this should absolutely reach out to us, and we'll make the process seem really high level and not intimidating. So we could definitely use anyone's help next year. It was a really great effort. I'm so glad that the three of us participated.
Jennifer, is there anything else you want to add about what you would change or what you learned, or just to wrap up the experience?
Yeah. I, one thing that I thought was so valuable, actually, which was kind of like incidental, was that we supported each other throughout the day. We were in contact throughout the day and the days leading up to it during the training. And I don't know about you, but I had contact with some other people who were there. And so for all of its intimidation, we helped each other through it. And so I think that anybody on the fence about it who might feel like it's not, that they can't do it or shouldn't for whatever reason, might I would invite them to reconsider, because they will be supported throughout the day, whether it's us or other people. But if we're there, I know that we would be I know that we would be supportive either way. And I do think that really helps when you're getting into anything new, and especially talking about a disease that is close, that might make you emotional. A thing that I learned that just seemed clear throughout the day when talking to the representatives from these offices was that they were measuring silently how how our requests would work with their um, with each representative's political capital, because we were asking people to each time we meet with someone, we're asking them to risk something. And so I think we can't, I'm sure that's really obvious to anybody invested in politics or anything like
But to
this.
see that firsthand is
Yeah,
interesting.
it was really interesting. And that, I think, is what kind of prompts the question about whether or not we're going about it the perfect way. Because since we're asking them to make risks, shouldn't we be, we have to be convincing them of why it's worth it each time. And you can only go so far with a script that you're giving out to 250 people across the country who have different like personal situations and who haven't done this over Zoom before, if at all. And but it was definitely really clear that every time we made it a little more personal and a little more colloquial, the message got through seemingly a little more viscerally, a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
And I feel like that, I'm guessing that that goes a long way when you're asking someone to take a risk on you, that it's worth spending some of this political capital. And I think that I'm hoping that there's something that we can do with that as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think just to come full circle, the thing that I really took away from it was what, just to touch on what Brooke mentioned earlier, was we literally got to see, like, pull the curtain back and get like the nuts and bolts of what government work looks like, which is mostly very busy, stressed out people fitting meetings in while they're eating lunch at their desk, asking people to fill out forms, checking their emails, reading those forms, sending those forms to other people, talking about the forms, and trying to figure out how they can make as many people happy as humanly possible. I thought that was actually pretty cool. And I will say there were a couple moments, like after some of these calls, when we knew that we had an impact on the person we were speaking to, and then we would end the call, where I was like completely on cloud nine, where I was like, we're doing it, we're doing the work, we're solving this problem. Like we could, it was really inspiring to me to feel like I was being part of the eventual solution after wanting to be a part of this solution for so long. That to me was like very fulfilling. And I, for one, and I know all of us feel the same way, like are very excited to do it again next year. I would like to be leading all of those meetings next year. I think we should all be leading those meetings, and not be as much of a bystander and take a more active role. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was super inspiring. And like you said, Jennifer, like, I just think the Lyme community is amazing. I think the people that are in the Lyme community are amazing. I think so many of them have dealt with so much and have gone through so much. I'm just always blown away. When I'm in any group of Lyme people, I always feel like, oh, these are my people. I just totally, I was not surprised that people rose to the occasion, even with physical symptoms, neurological symptoms, chaos of the day, whatever, like everyone stepped up. And I just thought that was really great. And I'm never surprised that happens in the Lyme community, because it's just, people are so amazing there, you know?
I know I said this to you in a text at the end of the day, but I feel like it's worth mentioning that I feel more comfortable talking about these things now than I ever would. And that's because of Generation Lyme. And it's not to plug our own thing, but it's really true.
Hey.
Because I was thinking about how qualified this group is to speak.
Yeah.
You come into these spaces and it's really hard to talk. And I know for me at the beginning of it all, I was like, I might as well have had hives, or I literally may have had hives in the beginning, just because it felt really hard to talk about the situation, because it's so heavy and it's so personal and it's so complicated. But having had the opportunity to continue working on that, and hearing other people do it themselves and be so compassionate toward each other, actually, I think really kind of prepped me and preps anyone for something like this, because it's just not as difficult and as scary as it seems, especially when you've had some practice talking about it and you know you have people there to support you.
Totally. Brooke, anything you want to add before we wrap this up?
I honestly can't think of anything that I would add.
We
I think
did it.
Jennifer summed it up very, very well.
Crushed it. All right. Well, on that note, go team. On that note, we're gonna wrap it up. On behalf of Jennifer Hoffmann and Brooke Stoddard, my name is Jesse Ruben. You have been listening to the Generation Lyme podcast. Please rate us 5 stars. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you get your podcasts. If you haven't yet, follow us on Instagram, come to our meetups. We've got a bunch of them. They cover all different topics. Everyone is welcome, and they're a great place to find community. Let us know if there's anything we can do for you. We're easy to find at genlyme.org. And other than that, have a great day. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks so much. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer.